For more on Syria, let's talk now with investigative journalist Garet Porter. Garet, can you start by talking about the situation in Deir ez-Zor right now? This is really the front line against ISIS at the moment.
Well, it is in the sense that this is where ISIS now has the greatest offensive pressure. They've surrounded the city, of course, as I think you reported, and they've got fighters coming in from Iraq, where they're in retreat. And in fact, you know, Deir ez-Zor is on the main route that fighters have taken going back and forth between Syria and Iraq. So that's one of the reasons why it's so a strategic objective for both sides, really. But for the Syrian Russian forces, it has been a secondary objective given other priorities. So I think this has given the ISIL forces an opportunity to put more pressure on between the situations in the two countries being as they are.
And is the U.S. or anyone else assisting with this fight and holding back ISIS?
Well, the United States has not done very much, let's put it that way. They have been carrying out strikes in the Deir ez-Zor area for a long time. That is the U.S. allied Operation Inherent Resolve operation. But almost all of their strikes have been against oil wells and other economic targets. Once in a while, they will say that they've hit an ISIL checkpoint, and they did so during the fighting that we're now talking about, where the ISIL forces, tightened the siege on Deir ez-Zor and essentially cut the city in two parts, isolating as many as perhaps 200,000 or more people. Civilians in the government-controlled part of Deir ez-Zor, which is rather an interesting parallel with Aleppo.
I was going to bring that up, Gareth, because we heard in Western media the word Aleppo, 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 again and again and again. We heard reports on what was happening there, unconfirmed reports at that. Almost a complete blackout on the situation in Deir ez-Zor, similar with the situation in Wadi Barada, or when they didn't have, when the rebels cut off water to millions of people in Damascus. What's the disconnect with the reporting here?
Well, of course, yes, you're right. The Western media have totally blacked out what's going on around Deir ez-Zor right now. It's simply not a story for them, despite the fact that, as I just said, there are great similarities between that situation and the siege of East Aleppo. And roughly the same number of people, perhaps even a lot more people than were in East Aleppo during that siege. So it just simply underlines the lack of equality of coverage between these two very similar situations. And I think that's a telling point about the way in which Western media are covering Syria.
I wonder, though, why the fact that hundreds of thousands of civilians are under assault from ISIS wouldn't be a big story in the U.S.
Should be.
Back to the point of the U.S. role in Deir ez-Zor, there was quite an infamous incident last year. The U.S. bombed Deir ez-Zor. They just didn't hit ISIS, right, Gareth?
Right. I mean, this is a story, again, that was covered for a day and then forgotten by the Western media, which was about the fact that U.S. and allied planes bombed the Syrian government bases near the airport at Deir ez-Zor, killing dozens, wounding dozens more. And we now know, because of the investigation report that was issued weeks later, several weeks later, that the evidence is very strong that was produced by the investigators themselves, that this was a deliberate attack, not just a mistake, as was claimed, of course, by the CENTCOM and the command that carried them out. And I'm the only reporter who's written about this. It's been completely blacked out in the media.
That report was striking because it actually found that the U.S. misled Russian officials about where they were striking, correct? So they strike a Syrian army point. Fast forward a few months later, that's a key point in the Syrian army's battle against ISIS. This
is one of the several indicators that were reported in this investigation report that showed that it's virtually impossible that this was a mistake. We don't have time to go into those details, but I've covered those in my own story about this. And what is more important, I think, even more fundamental about this incident, is that this was part of a titanic struggle within the Obama administration between the Pentagon and the U.S. military in the region on one side and John Kerry and the State Department on the other. Kerry actually said publicly after that investigation report came out, telling point, that there was bitter opposition within this administration. He said we had divided ranks in the administration. This is a very unusual statement to make about this specific issue of the reaching agreement with Russia that was supposed to coordinate their efforts against ISIL as well as Al-Qaeda in Syria, so against Nusra Front. So this is another very important indication that something extremely important took place, that I think now John Kerry realizes that there was a deliberate attack that was sabotaging the Obama administration's policy in Syria.
And talk about that policy specifically. Remind viewers at that point in history, in the history of this conflict, the U.S. and Russia had just reached a landmark agreement. This strike sabotaged it.
Right, and the agreement was that not only was there to be a ceasefire, but that the United States and Russia would coordinate their air efforts, air strikes, against ISIL as well as against Nusra Front. And this was to take place once there was a minimum period, about a week, of a ceasefire that was effective. It looked like that was going to take place, although there was also a demand later by the Obama administration that there had to be a delivery of humanitarian goods by the Syrian government to allow that to take place. But that was happening. So I think it was very clear that the Pentagon and CENTCOM were afraid this was going to go ahead. And the timing was such that it just cut it off days before it might have taken place. And
Kerry made some very strong statements, as you said, after this CENTCOM report came out, also about the nature of the opposition. Correct? We only have about a minute left, so if you could just sum up this other divide in the administration, the view of the so-called rebels. Right, and this is a statement that John Kerry made just days after the attack on the Deir ez-Zor bases of the Syrian army. He said, and this has never been said before or since, that the armed opposition in Syria had, some at least of the armed opposition, had an unholy alliance with Al-Qaeda in Syria. Now that was a very, very strong statement that indicated that he was trying to convey that at least the State Department, and I think the White House as well, were taking seriously the effort to do something about Al-Qaeda, trying to communicate to Syrian government and Russia, and knowing that the Defense Department and the U.S. military had taken steps that had basically sabotaged that policy. And where can viewers find that report where you detail the Central Command report, which basically proves the fact that that strike couldn't have been a mistake? Well, this was on the website of TruthDig just a couple of weeks ago. I think TruthDig, RT, all on the proper, not Russian propaganda list, right? So thank you for your work there, Gareth. And here as well, we always appreciate having you in studio, investigative journalist Gareth Porter.